right now. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on our weekly lunch and learn study break. So I hope you have your lunch with you. We would love for you to this is informal. It's an informal conversation. It's a time for us to break away from our jobs and just come together and study some Torah and perhaps study some interesting aspects that are on a lot of our lives and do it in a little bit more depth. And so we have brought with us here a guest. Our guest is Rabbi Amy Levin, who is coming to us from Hanaton in Israel, and she is a member of the Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards. And just a couple of weeks ago, Rabbi Levin, we studied the Teshuvah written by Rabbi Heller in great depth as part of our Lunch and Learn discussion. And then we have also found out that this continues to be a question, I think a question about what is the role of the CJLS vis-a-vis the conservative movement? How does the CGS go about making these opinions? And then I think we want to talk a little bit about the sum and substance of the Teshuvah itself. So we are currently running programming here at Congregation Beth Shalom virtually like this, and doing it in a way that we're doing it. Excuse me, I'm just trying to fix something here. We're doing it in a way that is accessible. We're learning. We're even doing minyanim. We're trying to make that very pastoral and meaningful for our congregation. And we're trying to find alternative ways to be present in ways that resonate with our community, but we have not been programming on Shabbat. And this question continues to come up as the Teshuvah was written. And a lot of conservative congregations are beginning to figure out how do they keep the Shabbat at the same time as be together with people. So I just want to acknowledge that there's a loss for people, especially for members of our community for whom Shabbat is an important moment in their week. It's a day they look forward to. They look forward to being with other friends. They look forward to praying. They look forward to having a schnapps. And they look forward to singing. And I think there's been a real loss over these last 14 weeks of not being able to do that. And so we acknowledge that loss. And I understand the desire that people want to fill that in. And so this conversation comes from a place of complete love of people who want to have Shabbat and do Shabbat. But because the city of San Francisco is forbidding us to gather in the near term, and also a number of our congregants have comorbidities and are of the age that they have to be particularly careful. And so there's also, I think, a greater issue of inclusion, where how do we include everyone in our services, especially if we think about reopening and then having to serve those people who are both able to be present and not able to be present. Now, before I go to you, I didn't know that Rabbi Levin was going to join us until about 2 hours ago. And I have some material here that I think is worthwhile, because one of the questions that I have been asked is to provide some thought process for how I've been thinking. And what I wanted to do, and we can go in various degrees of depth here, but I just first wanted to begin not with Marshall McLuhan, because Marshall McLuhan can come later, I think. I wanted to begin, before I move to McLuhan, I wanted to start with, where is he? Abraham Joshua Heschel. Does everyone see this? Abraham Joshua Heschel? Just somebody give me a yes if you can see this Heschel text here. Yeah. Wonderful. So this comes from the Sabbath, and if I was being super cheeky, I would say a lot of us are really finding meaning in Abraham Joshua Heschel in this moment. And so I think we should take a look at what he has to say on this particular issue. And so I just want to begin, and then I'm going to introduce Rabbi Levin with the words of Abraham Joshua Heschel, our rabbi, where he says, technical civilization is the product of labor, of man's exertion of power for the sake of gain, for the sake of producing goods. He goes on the next paragraph, how proud we are of our victories in the war with nature. Proud of the multitude of instruments we have succeeded in inventing Yet our victories have come to resemble defeats. In spite of our triumphs, we have fallen victims to the work of our hands. He goes on, is our civilization a way to disaster, as many of us are prone to believe? Is civilization essentially evil to be rejected and condemned? The faith of the Jew is not a way out of this world, but a way of being within and above this world, not to reject, but to surpass civilization. The Sabbath is a day in which we learn the art of surpassing civilization. He goes on here. He says, the Sabbath is a day of abstaining from work, is not a deprecation, but an affirmation of labor, a divine exaltation of its dignity. Thou shalt abstain from labor on the seventh day is a sequel to the commandment of 6 days you have to do your work. To set one day apart a week for freedom, a day on which we would not use the instruments would have been so easily turned into weapons of destruction, a day for being with ourselves, a day of detachment from the vulgar, of independence, of external obligations, a day on which we stop worshiping the idols of technical civilization, a day of armistice in the economic struggle with our fellow man and the forces of nature. Is there any institution that holds out a greater hope for man's progress than the Shabbat? And he says here on the bottom, on the Shabbat, we live, as it were, independent of technological civilization. We abstain primarily for any activity that aims to reshape the things of space. He goes into the labor a little bit that is to be done, but I just want to close out this introduction with what he said towards the end here, which I have lost here. Let me just go up for a second. Hold on. There we go. The Sabbath, thus, is more than an armistice, more than an interlude. It is a profound conscious harmony of man and the world, a sympathy for all the things and a participation in the spirit that unites what is below and what is above. All that is divine in the world is brought into union with God. This is Shabbat and the true happiness of the universe. 6 days you shall do all your work. Is it possible for a human being to do all of his work in 6 days? Does not our work always remain incomplete? What the verse means to convey is rest on the Sabbath as if all of your work were done, or rest even from the thought of labor. A pious man once took a stroll in his vineyard on the Shabbat. He saw a breach in the fence and then determined to mend it when the Sabbath would be over. At the expiration of the Sabbath, he decided, since the thought of repairing the fence occurred to me on the Shabbat, I shall never repair it. So I just wanted to begin with the words of Rabbi Heschel, who has been very meaningful to me in my study, and I know to many people across the world. And this is one of, if not his most popular works. And I think what is missing in this conversation about how do we solve this problem is, should we be solving the problem? And what exactly is the problem to solve? And so Rabbi Levin here, and let me open up her document here. Rabbi Levin published a dissent to the opinion that we discussed a couple of weeks ago. And in her dissent, here's what she says. She says that the basis upon which they made the decision was that this was we're in a new world. And I think we all can acknowledge that there is a new world. However, she notes that we actually do not yet know what kind of pivot is going to be necessary in order for us to maintain and transmit that covenantal relationship between us and with God. And she hones in on the question that is at the heart of it is the existence of the Jews per se and Jewish community per se threatened to the point where the emergency principles of sakanat nefashot or sha'at hadachat, which we talked about, which is this is a moment of great need, lives are at risk, does that actually need to be invoked here? And I think that is a good place to stop because I really think you crystallized the question. And I want to introduce to everybody here and spotlight Rabbi Amy Levin, who is coming to us from Israel and Hanaton. And so I'm curious to know, we've all, I think on this call, we have over 31 people here. We've been discussing this, we've been debating it. Can you tell us, I guess, to begin with, how you ended up on the Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards. I think there's some confusion about what purpose it serves. And then if you can tell us a little bit about the process in making this decision. And thank you again for joining us.
Sure, I am, first of all, deeply honored to be invited and really happy to hear from Rabbi Russell at any point, but to hear from her over this was just really delightful. The Committee on Jewish Law and Standards is a collaborative working group. We have, I think it's 23 or 25 rabbis who are all members of the Rabbinical Assembly. At the moment, I am the only member of the committee from Israel. There is another member from Latin America, and all the rest of the rabbis on the committee are from the United States, and there's a few from Canada. In addition to the rabbis, we also have lay representatives from United Synagogue, and they are usually people who contribute a tremendous amount to our deliberations. At the moment, we have an attorney and an ethicist, a medical ethicist. We've had a physician for a while on the committee as well, so that the knowledge that these people bring is tremendously helpful to us, and they often collaborate with us on our tshuvot, on our responsa. This literature of questions and answers in Jewish law go back to the beginning of the rabbinic period. The Judaism that we practice today is not Israelite. Faith. We don't have a tabernacle or a temple anymore. We don't bring sacrifices. So when we made that pivot with the destruction of the temple, we had to regroup, and the regrouping became the regrouping was born of smart, dedicated people sitting around a table asking each other questions. And the uber question was, well, what do we do now? We don't speak biblical Hebrew anymore. We're not nomads anymore. We have a different economy. We're speaking a different language, but we want to keep faith with this covenant that we made with God 1,000 or 1,500 years ago, or whatever it was at that time. And so what do we do now? And the questions that we ask around the table at the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards are basically the same questions. So, so what do we do now with our reality and our technology and new challenges that come up all the time, and new fields of knowledge that never existed before, and things that researchers are constantly bringing to light, not only in terms of technology, but in terms of human psychology and in terms of the understanding of what a community is from a sociological point of view, and just innumerable things.
And just to add, we as conservative Jews view this as an extension of halachic jurisprudence that dates all the way back to the Talmud. Just as the rabbis gathered and answered novel questions, we believe it is still our right and responsibility as leaders and as rabbis to meet and to answer difficult questions. And we don't feel that that process is disconnected from the process that happened way back when. I think it's important to understand that, because that's central to us as conservative Jews.
Yes, that's absolutely the case, right? In terms of how the other thing that's important to note is that our responsa, the tshuvot that we publish from the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, are generally not binding documents. We do publish from time to time, very rarely, a standard, and the standards are binding on members of the Rabbinical Assembly, members of the Cantors Assembly, and United Synagogue congregations. But the tshuvot are considered to be well-researched, well-documented arguments for a specific halachic stance that are offered to our colleagues who are the ultimate arbiters of Jewish law for their congregations. Basically because not every rabbi in the field has the time to do the research. And so we do this in the hope that we're helping our colleagues on the ground to navigate some, at times, complex worlds and
Yeah,
questions.
it's very hard for a pulpit rabbi to do a deep dive into the sources that the committee is able to do.
Yes, that's absolutely the case. For me, it's a huge honor to be and privilege to be on the CJLS. I actually started life as in the reform world. I grew up in a reform temple in New Jersey. Loved my rabbi and had a bit of an awakening in high school that I did not quite know what to do with for several years until I discovered conservative Judaism. The awakening had to do with my asking my rabbi a question about Judaism, and the answer he gave me was, well, Judaism has something for everybody, and you do what's meaningful for you, and you don't have to do what's not meaningful for you, and I'm a baby boomer and post-war and all of that, and I knew all about the Holocaust when I was in high school, and I walked out of that conversation saying, really? People gave their lives for you do what you want to do, and you don't do what you don't? Something was kind of missing. And then I was introduced to this concept of covenant and brit and mitzvah, commandment and halacha, and found my theological and spiritual world in the conservative movement. Which, the other thing is, I started talking about being a rabbi when I was 10 years old. Nobody was ordaining women when I was 10 years old. I am, as I said, a baby boomer. So it took me longer to get to ordination because I decided I had to wait for the conservative movement to start ordaining women instead of reform. And then I had to wait for the conservative movement in Israel to ordain women because I had already moved to Israel. But anyway, so long story, it took me a long time to get there. One of my teachers and mentors has always been Rabbi Joel Roth, who is a central figure in the world of conservative Jewish law. And I got on the law committee basically because at one point, one of the chancellors, the chancellor has appointments to the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. And at one point, one of those openings was opening up, and Rabbi Roth said to Chancellor Eisen, have I got a rabbi for you? And so I'm one of the chancellor's appointments to the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. And as I said, it's a privilege. I go off for a few days to New York. I sit there with my fellow rabbis. We discuss issues. And when I come back, members of my congregation say to me, so how was it, Rabbi? And my answer is always, it's 2 days of nerdy rabbi fun. And it's 2 days of nerdy rabbi fun because 20-something rabbis are sitting around a table, passionately invested in what we're talking about. Everybody at the table knows what they're talking about. Everybody at the table cares what they're talking about. And when we disagree with mutual respect and love and this sense of whatever side of an issue we are on, it's l'shem shamayim. We're doing this out of a real sense for the sanctity of the work that we're doing. And that is a crucial thing to remember, especially when we get to a moment like this, like Rabbi Heller's tshuva, around which we had intense conversation. This was, of course, Zoom conversation, but intense conversation.
Can I pause you for one? Wait, can I pause you for 1 second?
Sure.
This is not insignificant. Does the fact that the debate took place over Zoom change it, materially change the conversation versus the debate that you might have in person, or did you find it very similar?
Well, no, because what happened was they changed the way the committee is functioning because there's a general acknowledgement that you can't spend hours and hours and hours on Zoom and be able to focus. Generally what happens is we meet in New York. We start on a Tuesday at like 11 o'clock in the morning. We work until 6 o'clock in the afternoon. The next day we show up at JTS again. We start at 9 o'clock in the morning and we finish at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There was no way nobody was going to survive that on Zoom. So instead, what they've done is they've broken it up into separate about hour and a half sessions about each particular paper that we are processing at the moment. So tomorrow evening at like I think 9:30 at night, my time in Israel, is our next session about the next paper that we are discussing. So we've been doing that instead of all of us being together in this really intense way for 2 days in a row.
Yeah, I have some McLuhan. I'm not going to go to it now, but it basically says once you adopt the medium, it's time, it's rapidity that often gets lost. And so it's interesting to hear about the whole process of even Talmudic discourse has to fit into technology. And I don't think that that's insignificant to this conversation. So tell us about the streaming and that debate. I was surprised by the overwhelming nature with which his teshuva passed. So give us the story about the debate and your dissent.
Okay, so we are back in, I guess, March, April, somewhere around there. We're already in lockdown in Israel, and things are starting to spread to the states, and from state by state. Well, you know better than I do. You know how different areas have been hit at different times and have reacted different ways. But it's becoming clear that that there needs to be some coping with this reality, that houses of worship are being closed down. What are we going to do, right? And Rabbi Heller, and I have to say this right off the bat, because I think this is part of this ethos of the CJLS. I have tremendous respect for Rabbi Heller. He is learned, he is serious, he has gravitas, he's a mensch. He does his work very, very thoroughly and with tremendous integrity. And he and I have actually written a tshuva together. So there are times when we've been on the same side and times when we're not on the same side. And that's kind of how we roll. That nobody gets angry about anybody. Nobody's offended because you didn't vote for my tshuva. It absolutely does not work like that among the colleagues in the law committee. He has his bachelor's degree is in computer science. So he was like the person to kind of pick this up, because he understands the technical side of how all of this technology works much better than many others of us on the law committee. And God bless, he stepped up and he started to research this and process it and work on it. And there is a growing sense of urgency and perhaps even panic about what's going to happen to our congregations, what's going to happen to our people, how long is this going to go on? And one of the excruciating things about this, and I don't have to tell you all about it, one of the things that's hardest to deal with is nobody knows how long this is going to go on, right? And whether things are going to surge again or not surge again, or it's hugely difficult to have a sense of, I know what's going on, when really and truly nobody really knows what's going on. So all of that's going on in the background, and Rabbi Heller is working through the technical issues of how live streaming works and how Zoom works and what's going on behind the scenes with the technology. And he's working his way through all of those things. And he is consulting with a lot of colleagues from a lot of different communities. And there seems to be a sense, first of all, that a lot of communities are already live streaming and are starting to work on Zoom without benefit of guidance from the law committee. So the hope is that the paper that he would produce would address some of the technical issues that at the moment are being ignored by the communities that are already doing this anyway. That at least if they're going to do it, they should do it within a framework that is more cognizant of the technical side and Shabbat issues together, which in many cases was not actually going on. I think another piece of this is just sort of like momentum. This sense of we need to step up and do things and change things because it's getting urgent, it's getting worse, right? And the numbers in the states are, just like unbelievable. You know, from week to week, the numbers are just horrific. So the issue is becoming more and more pressing, and the pressure, I think, is mounting. And Rabbi Heller comes up with this paper that says, if you're going to do it this way. And I read the paper, you know, very, very thoroughly. I sent him notes, you know, privately. We had a conversation. First of all, we had emailing back and forth about it, and then we had this group discussion about it. So that's how technically the thing happened. Should I stop and take a breath about something now?
Did anybody, was there a holistic view? What has struck me unfavorably was the fact that he was a computer science expert, which I thought was the wrong message to send in the press release. We've consulted this Harvard computer science expert to make our decision about our Jewish body of law. It almost seemed like we're abdicating authority to a higher authority, and that higher authority is computer science and to Harvard. I thought that was an unfortunate message to send from the CJLS. Was there a question about the holistic approach, about the nature of Shabbat itself, what the ultimate values about Shabbat? I've been talking a lot about Marshall McLuhan, the medium being the message. And I was disappointed that there was a dearth of discussion around some foundational issues, which is why I began with the Heschel quote. It doesn't seem to me anybody was taking that into consideration or asking from a holistic standpoint, what do we do? What becomes of the Shabbat in which we are the ones making it and using our technology to make the Shabbat? And then after, you know, if you can give me a sense on that, then I see some other questions already coming in from our guests, and I'm gonna take you off of Spotlight, and we're gonna have 25 minutes for a nice Q&A from everybody here. I'm just wondering, just the larger holistic theological, I studied with Rabbi Gilman for 6 years when I was at the seminary. For me, understanding the theological framework, why we're praying, how we're creating a platform in which we can experience the sense of the divine. My congregation, I've been here for 2 years. My congregation has already heard plenty about Martin Buber. The idea that if we can gather together and create a living middle in the midst of each other, that God's presence can be felt in that space. And I've also, you know, been trying to teach a little bit about the separation of the Kodesh from Chol. And especially now when we find ourselves, we can no longer, as I've been saying, we can't pretend we're still in the 20th century anymore, right? Once all of our meetings are now this way, there's no pretending we're still in the 20th century. We're going into a new normal. It seems to me that there might want to be a heightened effort to try to preserve that sense of intimacy. And I've been arguing that the medium of Judaism is the minyan. And to change that medium from being the in-person minyan to being an online Zoom call, which already feels dated. Rabbi Heller's article already feels dated 3 weeks later. I'm wondering, were we just trying to discuss as rabbis how to make this happen because the people wanted it? Or were we engaging in larger theological conversations about it?
So it's kind of a hard question to answer. The first thing that I want to address, though, is was your sense of discomfort with a computer scientist being the person to write this. Because to my mind, one of the major principles of conservative of the conservative halachic process, as opposed to certain kinds of orthodox process, is that we rely on the people who have the expertise in the particular field that we're working in to inform us, to make sure that we're taking advantage of up-to-date knowledge and up-to-date research and up-to-date understanding. So I would respectfully disagree with you and say, out of all of us, he was the one to write it. Because if anybody was going to come up with guidance for how to do this and skate as close to the edge of halacha as possible while still doing this, he was the one who was going to have the tools to do that. No, there wasn't really a whole lot of conversation about the big picture context of this, because everybody around the table, that particular table, the CGL's table, knows that and is committed to it, right? So when we're working on a paper, the conversation is very much focused on the paper. Generally what happens is every fall, we examine the questions that have come into us. We then divide up the questions among us. Each question is assigned to a subcommittee. We have a subcommittee that focuses on a specific area of Jewish law. The first drafts go through the subcommittee, and then at some point the subcommittee says, okay, you're ready for prime time, and then you go to the larger committee. The larger committee does a first reading. There's feedback to the author. The author goes home, does research, comes back again. There's a second reading, and sometimes there's even a third reading. So in general, the process that these papers have to go through to actually get to a vote is very, very rigorous and can take 18 months. Rabbi Heller had this sense of urgency, and people were pushing him to get this out. So his process was short-circuited in that way, which I don't want to suggest affects the quality of the work, because I don't believe it affected the quality.
No, I'm not. My question isn't about the quality of the work. I want to quote our teacher, Rabbi Roth, because we've also studied Rabbi Roth, and he was my teacher. And what he said when he began investigation into females being ordained as rabbis, he began with the disposition of wanting to find a way to make it work. And he said he entered into the source with a deep belief that, if possible, he wanted to see how to find a way to have women become rabbis. And I guess I'm wondering is, did the CJLS enter into this with the object to make this kosher from the outset and to find a way to do it? Or was it asking the larger questions about if we should?
I would say that the process was very similar to the way you described Rabbi Roth's process about the ordination of women. It was, here's a pressing issue. Everybody feels like we need to deal with this. Let's see if this is possible.
Gotcha. Okay, I want to open it now. I'm going to take you off of the spotlight. Thank you for engaging me in some of my questions. I'm going to take you off of the spotlight and go. I see we have a couple of questions already put into the chat. So Alex, if you want to ask your question, then Ben, you can ask your question next.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about the way in which time factors into it. Like, if there's a, God forbid, threat for a specific Shabbat on a specific shul, how does that differ from like an extended period threat? And how does that factor into these kinds of questions?
So when there's a short-term urgency to an issue, what generally happens is a colleague or a member of a community will turn to one of the chairs of the committee, and they will be given either an oral or a short written immediate response. In this particular case, we were kind of in this intermediate stage where we didn't, it wasn't that somebody needed an answer in 24 hours, but on the other hand, people needed an answer in something less than 18 months. So Rabbi Heller went through this kind of accelerated process, kind of consulting with a bunch of us along the way as he was doing the writing.
Alex also had a follow-up question, which is on your halachic, which is mentioned in the Teshuvot, which is, how would the duration of the pandemic impact the decision-making process? So you mentioned we don't know where this is going. We don't know how long this is going to last. And so Alex also had the additional question is, how does that impact halacha?
So it certainly impacts halacha, and if you, I don't know whether you had a chance to read my dissent, but that's one of the things that was on my mind. Is it's true that nobody knows how long this is going to go on, but maybe it's not going to go on as long as people think it's going to go on, right? Not long ago, we in Israel were limited to not going further than 100 meters from our front door. And now synagogues are open again, schools are open again, shopping malls are open again. You know, I mean, you have to walk around with a mask and, you know, whatever else. But we've moved through those stages fairly quickly because, you know, as opinionated as Israelis are, they're also used to taking orders. So when the Ministry of Health says you're not doing something, everybody kind of says, oh, all right, we're not going to do something, right? Whatever that is. So we have a sort of a discipline, a communal discipline here that perhaps, you know, doesn't work in the States is quite as well. But what we have been through here has been a model for you go through whatever you go through, and then you come out the other end, and you come out from the other end in stages, and you do it carefully. And we've been back in our synagogue buildings officially since the week before Shavuot. My congregation took an extra week to go back into the building because, frankly, I have an aging congregation. Everybody, including me, are in, you know, this danger age. You know, I forgot what it's called in English. So, so we took an extra week and we did Shavuot and Shabbat together for the first time. And before that, and what every conservative Masorti congregation in Israel was doing was, we were getting together for Kabbalat Shabbat, and we would end about 10 minutes before candlelighting. And then we would wait for Havdalah, and we would get together at the end, and we would do Havdalah, we would sing, and we would, you know, whatever. And that's kind of, we had this kind of like parentheses around Shabbat, so people heard the melodies that were iconic, heard many of the words that were iconic, got to look at each other. And, you know, whenever I had my Zoom going with my congregation, I always made sure there was time to just say, you know, how are you doing? And who's got an update, and, you know, things like that. So people felt that there was some connecting going on, even though we weren't in the same room together and we weren't communicating during Shabbat itself. When we walked back into the building for the first time, it was really intense. It was like, oh, we're back. This is amazing, right? Even though we're wearing masks and we're sitting 2 meters apart and all this other stuff that's going on, we were back and we could do the whole tefillah. And there was a tremendous sense of we held strong, you know, we were creative, we figured out how to work around it, and now we're back, and the only thing we can't do is hug, right, and eat. But okay, we'll get to that at some point too. So that was not so much a part of Rabbi Heller's process, because I feel that he felt that his charge was figure out how to do the streaming and the Zooming with least damage to the halachic aspects of Shabbat as you possibly can. That was his charge.
Gotcha. I got choked up when you're talking about, I mean, I was up at like 2:30 to 6 a.m. this past night thinking about being back, and just the idea of even back in the sanctuary, I get a little emotional. And I've only been here for 2 years, but the thought of returning is very powerful. So Ben Chin is the president of our congregation. He has a question that he wants to ask.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I had a small question, and I got so many questions. I mean, this is so fascinating, right? It's just so many things coming together in this question. So I guess my short question was just how many members of the CJLS are congregational rabbis, right? Because this is, there are, you know, halakhic questions, but then there are questions of sort of the real lived experiences of ordinary people practicing Judaism, right? And those aren't, you know, mesh more or less, right, in different kinds of situations. So, but I had another kind of question in terms of, you know, the workings of the CJLS. It seems to be by design reactive, right? It seems to be, in terms of your description, seems to be focused very much on problems rather than opportunities, right? So it seemed like people started doing something. It wasn't something that we had the word from the CGLS as to how to do. And so, you know, that body got together to try and figure out, okay, well, how do we react to this thing that people are doing, right?
Right.
And whereas I think there are a lot of rabbis and congregations, certainly, who are focused on how do we create opportunities, right? How do we find you know, ways of making or remaking Jewish tradition to work better for our congregations, and you know, everybody seems to be doing that differently, and you know, that kind of maybe creates situations in which the CGLS then has to react. So I
Right.
guess my bigger question there is there a role for leadership, right, at a movement level rather than, you know, reaction?
Right. Okay. So a couple of things. First of all, I don't know what the exact number is, but I would say easily 2/3 of the rabbis on the committee are congregational rabbis. And a few of them are academics and a few of them are retired. But yeah, for the most part, actually, most people are congregational rabbis. But congregational rabbis from all different kinds of contexts, you know, small congregations, large congregations, urban, suburban, Israeli, you know, I mean, there's all kinds of things going on around the table. But yes, for the most part, people are engaged in congregational work as well as volunteering for the law committee. In terms of reactive, look, some of this is just the nature of the genre, right? The genre is, in Hebrew, is called she'elot v'tshuvot, questions and answers, right? So you got to get the question so that you can answer it, right? And in general, it's actually, I think it should be like a conversation, right? You know, we're getting questions from real situations that are happening in real places that are affecting real people, and we're getting this like, whoa, we don't quite know what to do with this. What should we do, right? So I understand what you mean by leadership, because another kippah that I wear is I'm actually a congregational consultant. So I understand about leading communities and leading congregations and leadership teams of clergy and lay leadership, and that's like my thing. But this is a different role. And I don't see it as a
Sorry,
weakness.
I don't mean leadership in terms of congregational leadership. I mean leadership in terms of showing a path,
Right,
right?
right.
That's right, and you know, not in terms of leading people, right?
Right,
But in terms of, yeah, in terms of saying this is the direction we're going to go in, right?
right.
Rather than saying, okay, well, at a much smaller level, like this is a specific problem we have to solve.
So I would like to see conservative and Masorti leadership stepping up to do that kind of leading. Right now, you know, our leadership is very much in transition. Rabbi Jacob Blumenthal, who's taken over the Rabbinical Assembly, is going to be leading United Synagogue as well. I have had a few interactions with him. I've been very favorably impressed. And perhaps he is going to be able to launch that sort of leadership. But whether he does or not, that's not going to be the role of the CJLS. Because we need to be doing the research into the sources and doing this weaving together of contemporary reality with the traditional sources, and keep our process within the framework of what the halachic process is. And that's a piece of what needs to happen in terms of leadership of conservative and Masorti Judaism, but it's only a piece of it, and other people need to be doing the other pieces of it.
Thank you. That's a really good answer. And also, you know, she'elot and tshuvot, that's how the system works. And, you know, one of the basic principles, we don't answer questions of halacha and hypothetical, because we need
Right.
the practical test case in front of us. Sandy Edwards and then Gary Sokol.
Well, my question had to do about how this relates to our thinking about the high holidays. I mean, and will we really be ready to get together? And not everybody's going to be comfortable, even if we're ready. And so, how does this thinking relate to the high holidays?
Right. So part of what's difficult about this is we are now in like almost the middle of June, and Rosh Hashanah for a change is on time. It's, you know, like the middle of September, right?
Right.
So who knows what's going to be by the middle of September where any of us are, you know? I mean, right now we're going to be in shul, but if God forbid there's some resurgence of COVID in Israel, we won't be in shul again, right? So we're going to have to deal, who knows who will be dealing with what, when, and that's part of what's so uncomfortable about this whole thing, is nobody's got a schedule. And I have to tell you that as we opened our doors and we started to come back, there were members of the congregation who didn't come back because they weren't comfortable coming back, or there were people who came and then kind of like left immediately after services were over and didn't want to stay for schmoozing in the lobby, even though like people standing, right? So everybody's like in a different place. I feel that all that we can do as the policymakers is to understand as best we can the boundaries of halakha and the realities of our community, and to do the best we can to weave those things together. It could very well be, and God willing, you know, as we say, that by the time we get to the middle of September, your shul will be open and you'll be able to go and sit to, you know, 2 chairs apart from each other, or, you know, whatever it is, and be able to be together. And maybe some of you are going to be comfortable with that. Maybe some of you won't, but who knows, you know, the middle of September, that's a little while away. And it could be that no, it could be not, right? So one of the things that I tried to do at the end of the descent was to encourage people to think very kind of like creatively and out of the box about other ways to put us into the space of the space of sacred space and sacred time without being able to do it the way we would conventionally and normally want to do it. And it's going to work better, it's going to work worse, right? One of the things that we discussed was, can you fulfill the mitzvah of hearing the shofar if you're hearing it through a microphone instead of hearing it directly, right? And the immediate response would be no. You have to hear the shofar in its immediacy, right? Here in Israel, I can actually like walk around my neighborhood and I can stand out in the middle of a courtyard of an apartment building and I can blow my shofar and nobody's gonna freak out, right? I mean, you know, the ultra-Orthodox might freak out a little, but you know, basically everybody's gonna get it. Right. Whether you can do that in suburban New Jersey, I sort of doubt. I kind of doubt you might have a problem with that where you all are too. But the point is to start now to brainstorm and come up with crazy ideas about what's going to work in the interim until you can go back to being together as a community face to face, in the hope that when you get to the other side, you're going to look at each other and say, whoa, that was an insane ride, but we got through it together intact. And we're going to be talking about Rosh Hashanah of 2020 for the rest of our lives, right?
We will be doing that.
We will.
Beautiful. Gary Sokol.
This is an observation. I wonder what your thoughts on it are. My perception is when we do a strict adherence to the halachic process, we usually end up with chumrot. And one of the things the CJLS has done is expanded that process
stringencies. Sorry.
Stringencies. And below leniencies come from, for example, Rabbi Gordon Tucker using a meta-halachic analysis or using Agadah to create opportunities for leniencies. Yet I notice in this case, there's a total avoidance of any, at least from what I saw, of any meta-halachic analysis or agadah, but it strictly went to the halachic. And I'm wondering if in this case it may have been flipped, if we actually used a meta-halachic analysis or agadah, a la what we saw from Heschel, that it wouldn't be very supportive of kulot.
You're talking about the tshuva itself. Right. Yeah. So look, I mean, I'm not Rabbi Heller and I can't answer, for him in particular. I can tell you that in the halachic literature itself, in more than one place, one of the chachamim, one of the sages of the earliest rabbinic periods would say, it's much easier to say no than yes. And the person who manages to say yes brings a blessing on his head, so to speak, right? So even at that early point in the rabbinic process, there was an understanding that it's a challenge to broaden instead of to constrict. That ethos generally informs our committee in everything that we do. In this particular, this was such an idiosyncratic moment. Again, Rabbi Heller was being urged to churn this thing out as fast as he could, using his knowledge, using his understanding, using the realities of his own community and consulting with other rabbis. He had this insanely intense 3 or 4 weeks while he was working on this thing. And then I vote no, and I start getting the same pressure. People start saying to me, you have to write a dissent, you have to write a dissent, I wasn't planning on writing a dissent. I was planning on voting no and, getting off of Zoom. But it became clear that people needed to hear why I said no. I wrote the dissent, but I wrote the dissent literally in a day, basically. I wrote it in a day. I would generally never write anything for the law committee in a day. I'm telling you, it takes 18 months to get a tshuva out of this thing, right? So the whole thing is so compressed and so with this tremendous sense of urgency that, yeah, we love discussing meta halakha around the table. It's our, what do you call it? It's our
jam.
beef or what? It's our jam. Yes, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, I'm a little, between the Hebrew idioms and the English idioms, I sort of lose track of it. It's our jam, meta halakha. It absolutely is, and we have a lot of fun, and it's great, all that kind of stuff, and it's important, and it informs many of our tshuvot. But both for the tshuva and the dissent, neither of us really had time to do anything but focus on this really urgent moment of people are waiting.
Thank you. Raf Birdie has a question.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for this conversation. Best lunchtime I've spent in months.
You need to be doing something better with your lunchtimes.
So I wanted to make sure I kind of got the bottom line here of what the I don't know if there's a result or if there's kind of what did we just learn or find out, and then I want to see if the kind of implications are right or where my head was going. So obviously this is a conversation, it's evolving, but your take is specifically streaming services shouldn't be allowed on the Sabbath and in Chagim. Yet, in your dissent, you encourage us to be, creative. And you talk about kind of community-led events at that time, let's figure out a way to expand the circle, but still kind of stay within the sacred time and space of those time periods. But then there's encouragement to record and maybe do things a few days before or a few days after. One would just be, am I hearing you right? Two would be, if this becomes a little bit more normal, whatever that means, if this becomes the norm, what does that do? What does it do when the journey becomes more, self-service, when congregations and synagogues are actually expected to put out catalogs of kind of all this stuff, and there has to be more of a, maybe the expectation is that there's more of a journey to it, or there's a, I participated and there's like there's a social signaling of, you see, I listened to the rabbi's drash this week, even, you know, because we couldn't actually be there on Saturday. I think it's an opportunity. I think it's fascinating, but that's where my mind went.
Okay, good. Okay. In terms of what I had said about recording, it's not prohibited to record somebody singing Kol Nidre. It's prohibited to record somebody singing Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur, right? But if I am home and I can't get to shul, and it's Erev Yom Kippur, I need to hear that. I need to hear Kol Nidre. So if my cantor gets on Zoom 2 hours before the fast starts and just sings it so I can hear it, I feel like that's going to do something for my neshama that's otherwise going to be missing. And then my cantor gets to start the fast b'chavod, you know, in a respectful way, and I do too. And we meet at the other end, you know, 26 hours later to, you know, do whatever it is that we're going to do. But I wanted to acknowledge that there are certain words and certain melodies and certain tropes that are very much linked to our neshamas, to our souls. And if we are going to get through this weird period well and intact and feeling like we've done this as well as we can, we need to acknowledge the importance of those things. The same thing with hearing the rabbi's drash. So if you hear the rabbi's drash on Friday afternoon, instead of on Friday night or Shabbat morning, yeah, sure, it would be better to be sitting in shul and listening to him and watching the facial expressions, and I'm watching the body language, and I get to interact with that. That is the very dynamic than giving a drash over Zoom. But at least if I give a drash over Zoom, I've given my folks something to think about during the next 24, 26 hours when we get together. Because of COVID, right? So that's the idea of what I was suggesting in that brainstorming session at the end of the tshuva. Weird, fun, energizing things that we come up with for COVID. Those.
Hi, Rabbi Levin, nice to see you.
We used to share a pulpit.
I know. We used to share a pulpit.
Good.
You're back, Rabbi
Good.
Yain. Sorry.
Yeah.
I lost my feed there for a moment. I know that we are at the top of the hour. So I just want to thank Rabbi Levin for coming, if everyone can still hear me. Thank you, Rabbi Levin, for coming. This was fantastic. We really appreciate your insights. And I think most of all, we appreciate the conversation. So Toda Rabbah to you. And hopefully we can, if any more questions, please everybody follow up with me. And sorry that I lost my connection, but take care, everybody. Kol HaKavod. Oh, good.
Really a pleasure.
Yeah, now I'm back a little bit. So thank you again.
Sure.
I really appreciated the additional point that you made, which is to consider how people who might be doing teshuvah and crying and beating their chest might feel having a camera put on them. I thought that was another wonderful thing. to consider that, because often the observing changes the space itself and can
Yes.
detract from the Kedusha. I thought those were wonderful points, and thank you for your creative suggestions. And Raf and everybody here, we want to encourage that creativity and to think about how we can best serve. And of course, this is still a conversation that we are in process here. If you're interested in reaching out to our head of our ritual committee, I invite you to contact David Bayer, give him your feedback. We're going to be developing, as Rabbi Levin said, we're 3 months away. So we're going to be developing a whole bunch of interesting programs and teachers and plans and shofar blowing lessons and Talmud and Musar and wonderful stuff all throughout the month of Elul. So it's not simply about the Yamim Noraim. And then also we're going to plan on what can we do for the Yamim Noraim, and can we be together? How can we be together? And how do we serve those people who cannot be present? And we just really appreciate your leadership and your knowledge in this. So thank you for joining us. Kol hakavod to you for writing your dissent in a day. And you're right, people were asking for it. And I think a lot of people were very pleased to see that you had written it. So this is a conversation, this is ongoing. I think, as Rabbi Levin pointed out, we are the ones who are ultimately in the best position to determine what our Yamim Noraim should be. And the CJLS is here to provide us guidance to figure out the halachic parameters in which we can work, and to provide us a little bit of, more thoughts and more questions to consider as we plan for, however long COVID lasts, and of course for the high holidays. And I know that is on all of your minds, and it's certainly on all of yours. So Todah Rabbah to Rabbi Levin, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon. Take care.
It was really a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Shar Kohat.
Be well, everybody.
Thank you.
Chati.